Good afternoon, everyone. I am Rachel Stamasik-Luxton, the Director of Research and Training here at the Dibble Institute, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to today's webinar on the success sequence, new research findings. We are honored and thrilled to have several researchers here from Mathematica to present their findings, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. But before we do, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you're having a hard time hearing us, the email invitation that you got does provide a phone number that you can use to call in to access the audio for today's session. If there's anything else technically wrong, you can sign out and log back in, as that typically solves the issue. You know, just the usual thing that we do when technology isn't working, you reboot it. We will be having you ask questions in the question box in the panel. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this session for some Q&A. Just so everyone knows too, there will be a recording of this session, including the slides and handouts that you can also find in that control panel. And those will be sent several days after the webinar with a link to access all of that. So let's get into a little bit of an introduction to the Dibble Institute. We go to that next slide there. And for those of you who may be newer to us and wondering how we got our name, on this slide you will see a picture of Charlie and Helen Dibble, who are the founders of the Dibble Institute. Charlie did a lot of work with youth during his retirement, and he saw that a lot of them were having difficulties around their relationships, or when their parents were having difficulties in their relationships, it was impacting those children. So he had the brilliant idea to translate research into teaching tools that could be made widely available. So the Dibble Institute is not a direct service provider, but rather we develop research-based practices and make them available for people like you all who are joining us on today's webinar. And a little bit more about the Dibble Institute since our creation by Charlie and Helen. We are a national independent nonprofit organization, and we have clients in all 50 states and couple abroad who are providing direct services to youth. And last year, based on our very conservative estimates, we believe that these clients over these 50 states reached over 115,000 youth based on the materials that they purchased. So we just want to take a moment to say that we are very grateful to all of you here who are doing this important work with those young people. So thank you for that. And with us being a national independent organization, that means we're really guided by our mission. And on the next slide, you'll see that our mission is to help young people successfully navigate their intimate relationships through important information to help them build their knowledge around relationship building, as well as research-based, skills-based practices. And we know that having these conversations with teens pulls a lot of levers. That's pregnancy prevention, dating violence prevention, mental health lever, and even job readiness. So it really has a widespread kind of impact there. And we're also guided by our values. And I want to talk about our first one on the next slide, because I kind of hinted at that when I said research-based skills. We're really big believers in research, as we have a research presentation today. All of our programs are research-based, and we continue to strive for evaluations on our programs to continue to demonstrate their impact and their effectiveness amongst youth. And with this, that also means that there are updates made to our programs as we learn new information, exactly like the updated research that will be discussed and presented in our webinar today. Something else that we are really big believers in are safe, stable, and healthy or nurturing families. And those are families of all different formations. And this is our goal for young people, to have these types of families for themselves and to be raised in these families as well. Additionally, we believe that relationship education is for everyone, and all of us can improve our relationships. Every single person here, everyone kind of everywhere. And we make sure that our programs are reflective of that, and that all youth and individuals who participate in these programs feel included and represented. So that's a little bit about the Dibble Institute, but I want to also give an introduction to our presenters today, who will be talking about the success sequence and these new research findings. First, I have Hande Enoch, and she is a senior researcher at Mathematica with more than 15 years of experience conducting rigorous research on youth and then using those findings to inform program and policy improvement. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Oxford. And we also have Ariella Spitzer, so close, Spitzer, who's a researcher at Mathematica. Ariella is a labor economist with more than a decade of experience designing and executing program and policy evaluations with a real focus on employment services for underemployed populations. She also holds a PhD in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School at Harvard University. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Hande and Ariella to present their findings.
Thank you, Rachel, for this great introduction. I'm Hande Nanj, and I'm really happy to be here today, and thanks everyone for joining today's call. Today with Ariella Spitzer, we're going to talk about some findings from a recent research that we conducted, where we tried to assess the benefits of Sexist sequence on economic self-sufficiency and family stability. Next slide. I just want to start with acknowledging our funders. So this project was funded by the Office of Assistant Secretary for Health at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and the project was managed by the Office of Planning, Research and Evaluation within the Administration of Children and Families. And our project officers and project monitor was Karen Blitz and Kathleen McCoy. We're eternally grateful for all of their insight and support throughout the project, and this research was conducted by myself, Ariella Spitzer, and Brian Gusling, who is also on the phone today. Next slide. All right, so let's start with talking about what the Sexist sequence is. So I'm assuming most of you know somewhat about Sexist sequence, but it's basically a theory that kind of emerged in 2000s and then became a popular policy approach for reducing poverty and improving economic opportunity for adolescents and young adults. And the works of Haskins and Sohill were one of the most prominent of the literature produced around Sexist sequence, especially the 2009 book titled Creating an Opportunity Society. So basically, Sexist sequence refers to a sequence of milestones that are associated with escaping poverty and joining the middle class. So there are really a lot of different definitions on what constitutes the Sexist sequence and its milestones, but the most common definition includes completing high school, obtaining full-time children. And all of these milestones have a lot of research and evidence behind them that connect them to economic outcomes in the future. But what is really unique about the Sexist sequence is that it emphasizes that the particular order individuals complete these milestones really matter. So it's really unique in that sense. And currently, there are at least 2 federally funded programs that incorporate some elements of the Sexist sequence into educational programming for youth. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these programs. One of them is the Sexual Risk Avoidance Education Program that requires grantees to teach the benefits associated with Sexist sequence for poverty prevention. And also some healthy marriage and relationship education programs also incorporated some of the aspects of the Sexist sequence model into their service provision models. Next slide. I want to talk about a bit of the motivation behind the study that we will be talking today. So back in the fall of 2018, the ACF contracted with Mathematica with us to conduct a literature review of the Sexist sequence. The findings were summarized in a report. I think it's also in the handouts that you see in the meeting platform right now. It was published back in December 2020. But what really motivated the study that we're going to be talking about today is that this review identified some gaps in the literature where further research was needed. So some of these gaps include, for example, there was limited evidence on whether the specific ordering of the milestones actually mattered, even though success sequence theory really emphasized the particular ordering of the milestones. Another gap we found was that research did not really test the different pathways individuals may take as they transitioned into adulthood. And methodologically speaking, much of the existing research, except for perhaps the works of Wilcox and Wang, used cross-sectional data. And therefore, most of the studies did not really account for the timing of especially education or employment milestones in relation to the other two milestones, marriage or childbearing. And finally, research also suggests that there was limited evidence on the range of outcomes that might be influenced by the success sequence milestones. So most of these research, or exclusively the research, considered economic outcomes in the future. Next slide. So in order to fill these gaps that we identified through the literature review and also expand the available evidence on success sequence, ACF again contracted with Mathematica to conduct a quantitative study of success sequence. And in the study, we examined three main research questions, and we will be providing our findings on these three research questions today. So we started by asking at the very descriptive level, so by age 30, what proportion of young adults have completed high school, had a full-time job, gotten married, and had children? And what are the most common sequences, like those pathways by which young adults complete these milestones? Then we investigated how do these sequences vary by sociodemographic groups. We looked at gender, race and ethnicity, and family socioeconomic backgrounds and the differences in milestone completion. And finally, we investigated to what extent are these sequences associated with economic self-sufficiency and family stability later in adulthood, and we focused on ages 33 to 44. Next slide. Okay, so before I dive into the findings, I just want to go over our working definitions of some of the concepts that you will be hearing today. So first of all, we conceptualized the success sequence in our research as 4 milestones. The first one is the high school completion, and we measure this milestone as the date of obtaining a high school diploma. We excluded GED in our analysis, but if you have questions, we have some robustness tests and additional analysis that we can talk about what we found, also looking at the GED, but we just defined it as obtaining high school diploma. The employment milestone, we defined it as full-time employment, and we measured it as the start date of the first job that leads to working full-time, at least 35 hours per week, for at least 40 weeks in a given 52-week period. So all that's to say, we identified the first job that kind of turned out to be the first full-time, almost full-year job a young individual had in their life up to age 30. And marriage milestone, we measured it as the date of first marriage, and childbearing, we looked at the birth date of the first biological child. So these are the 4 milestones that we will be talking today. And the 2 outcome domains that we looked are economic self-sufficiency and family stability. So the family stability is an outcome that was not really studied in the previous research that we identified in the literature review. So we also looked at family stability in addition to economic self-sufficiency. And for each of these 2 outcomes, we looked at 3 main indicators. For economic self-sufficiency, we looked at non-poverty status, middle class status, and household income. And for family stability, we looked at the number of residential partner transitions up until age 30. This is kind of like the cumulative number of partner transitions, presence of at least 2 adults in the household, and we looked at relationship satisfaction as measured as happiness in current relationship. Next slide. All right, and lastly, before diving into the findings, some words on the data and methods. So in order to really get into the sequencing aspect and be able to look at the outcomes in the future, we leveraged 2 nationally representative longitudinal surveys in our study. So we used the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, the 1997 cohort, and also we used a National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent to Adult Health, which is also known as EdHealth. And using these 2 longitudinal data sets, what we first did was to identify which milestones were completed by age 30 and when, because we were able to establish the timing of each of the milestone completion in terms of months and years. And then we calculated the percentage of respondents who completed each milestone individually. For example, number of respondents, percentage of respondents who completed high school milestone. And then we looked at the milestones in combination, how many milestones and which milestones they completed by age 30. And then we looked at the percentage following a specific ordering of milestones. And finally, we used regression models and estimated the association between completion of milestones by the age of 30 and how these are associated with economic self-sufficiency and family stability outcomes later in life at ages 33 to 44. Next slide. All right, now let's move one more slide and start looking at the findings. So here in this chart, you are seeing the milestone completion rates. So this is kind of responding to our question, what is the milestone completion rate by the age of 30? And each bar is representing the share of respondents in our national representative survey who completed each of these milestones. They might have completed other milestones in combination, but here we're looking at individual milestones. So as you would expect, I assume by age 30, most young adults in our sample completed high school graduation and or had at least one full-time job. Around half of them by age 30 had gotten married, and just over half also had a child. We also looked at the age or the distribution of age that each of the milestones were completed, and we found that, again, expectedly, for high school graduation, most of our sample respondents were completed this milestone around age 18. But when we looked at the completion age of other milestones, we saw there was a wider variation in terms of when individuals complete full-time employment or marriage. So it was like more dispersed in their lifetime by age 30. Next slide. So after looking at milestones individually, then we looked at what combination of milestones young adults complete by the age of 30. Have they completed all 4 milestones, just a few of them, or none of them? So basically, because we have 4 milestones in total, we have 16 combinations of milestones, completing 0 milestones, 1 milestone, like one of them, or like 2. So here we just pulled the top of those 16 possible combinations. And in this sample, we found that in our data, about 30%, 31% even of the respondents completed all of the 4 milestones. This is not to say they completed them in order, but they completed high school, employment, marriage, and childbearing, all of them by the age of 30. And this was the most common combination. The second most common was completing high school and then employment, but not completing the marriage or childbearing milestones. Next slide. And then we introduced the sequence aspect of the milestones. So again, because we have 4 milestones, and as someone can complete a combination of these milestones, a number of these milestones in any, like all different orderings, theoretically, we can have 65 possible sequences to complete all these or some of these milestones. And when we looked at our data, we actually found almost all of them were reflected in the data. We found 64 out of these like 65 theoretically possible sequences represented in the data. So this really highlighted the fact that pathway to adulthood is really, really complex, and there's a lot of diversity. And when we looked at what are the common sequences, most common sequences, so nearly all of the most common ones started with high school graduation followed by employment. And here there's this figure. I'm not sure how big you're seeing it in your screen, the numbers, but I'll just, you can look at the report for the full graphic, but I think this is a very powerful visual illustration of that diversity in pathways. And here we are seeing only 32 of those 64 observed sequences, and just a bit of a guidance on how to read this graph if you want to spend some time looking at it at the report by yourselves. So here we see that if you look at the top large green kind of like school image there, in our sample, 65% of the respondents completed high school as their first milestone. And then I'll give just one small example. If you look at the top row, we see that overall 51.8% completed high school and then employment in that order. And then 23% of them completed these two first milestones and then marriage milestone. And then 14%, two of them completed all the childbearing milestone afterwards. And also we see here the percentages of individuals who did not complete all of the 4 milestones. For example, 2.8% only finished high school and did not complete any other milestone by the time they were 30. So this is, I think, a really useful and powerful image to show that diversity in real life, in completing the milestones and achieving success sequence or not. Next slide. So this is just another way of looking at the data that was presented in that graphic in the previous slide. So here we are just showing the most common 10 sequences, the most common 10 out of those 64 sequences that we observe in the data. And we just ordered them by like the frequency of observing them. Again, share of individuals who completed only high school graduation followed by employment was 19%. And the full success sequence model, which is high school, employment, marriage, and childbearing, we observe only 14% of our sample completing success sequence by the age of 30. And the third one is high school graduation, employment, and marriage, but not yet having a child. So again, another illustration of the diversity of pathways in transition to adulthood. Next slide. So after looking at all of these milestones individually, in combination, and in order, we also replicated this whole analysis by socio-demographic groups to see if there's any diversity or group differences. Next slide. So I'll just talk about some of our findings. The report includes other additional findings, but some of the key takeaways for us was that, so what we found was that completing all 4 milestones, not necessarily in the success sequence order, but completing all of them was the most common combination for almost all groups. So what we observed for the overall population was true for 6 out of 7 groups that we looked at. But when we looked at the within group differences, we found a substantial variation in terms of the relative percentages. So for example, again, looking at by until the age of 30, completing all 4 milestones, we saw that the share who completed all of them were higher for females than males by almost like 7%, 6%. It was also higher for whites than for blacks by quite a margin, and then Hispanics. And it was also higher for young adults whose parents had some college education than those whose parents did not attend college. So these findings are really speaking to the diversity in transition into adulthood by different socioeconomic groups. But when we looked at also the differences at the completion of individual milestones, we found that the differences that we see in this milestone completion in combination, it really comes down to which individual milestones different groups complete. So if I give an example, maybe it's clearer. The percentage of young adults who reported having gotten married by the age of 30, it was higher for females than males. And then we see, like, again, this reflects into the differences observed in completing all 4 milestones. And also marriage rate was relatively lower for Blacks than whites. So really, these individual differences are driving what we see when we look at the milestones collectively and also in order. Next slide. Okay, I think now I'm going to pass it to Ariella, who's going to talk about our findings on the associations of success sequence with future outcomes.
Great. All right, thanks so much, Hande. So yeah, like Hande said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the association between these pathways that Hande talked about that youth take in their transition to adulthood and what we see for their economic self-sufficiency outcomes and their family stability outcomes. So I want to sort of talk first a little bit about how we came up with this research design. And so when we're thinking about estimating the economic and family stability impacts of the success sequence, the first thing we thought was, well, when do we want to look at that impact? And we landed on the late 30s and early 40s because we felt like that was really the time when individuals had actually landed firmly in adulthood, and that's when we would expect to see some of the most key impacts. And then the next question we wanted to ask ourselves was, well, what does it mean to evaluate the success sequence? And we thought about this in 3 different ways. So the first thing we said was the success sequence is this idea that they've identified these 4 crucial milestones that youth take in their pathway to adulthood. And so these 4 milestones, of course, are high school completion, employment, marriage, and childbearing, like Hande talked about. But so the first question we might want to ask here is just how much are each of these individual milestones associated with economic self-sufficiency and family stability? And so that's going to be the first question we're going to tackle. But then the more we thought about it, we sort of said the success sequence feels like more than that. It feels like it's really saying there's something special about the combination of these 4 outcomes that makes it greater than the sum of its parts. And so that it's really, if you hit these 4 milestones, that's really the ticket to economic self-sufficiency. And so another way that we thought about that was, how much does the combination of milestones that you complete matter relative to sort of what you could have come up with individually as the sum of its parts? Or do we need, is it important that when we do this research, we don't just look at high school or employment or marriage or childbearing, but that we really think about these as defining a pathway? So that's our second research question, is how much does the completion of these milestones in combination matter relative to how we would have thought if we just looked at the milestones individually? And then the third thing we said was the word sequence is right there in the success sequence. And it really implies, like Hande talked about, that the order matters because it defines this pathway that the youth take in their journey to adulthood. And so the third question we're going to ask is, conditional on completing a certain set of milestones, how much does it matter which order you complete them in? And I want to say one other thing about this research, which is that in this presentation, we're really only going to be able to look at associations. So we can tell you that someone who completed high school is 7 percentage points more likely to earn over the poverty line than someone who didn't. And we can tell you that that's true controlling for the observable characteristics that we can see in the data. But we can't see everything, right? So it very well may be the case that someone who's more driven or someone who's more likable, which are variables that we can't see in the data, is actually more likely to become economically self-sufficient and more likely to graduate high school. And we're not going to be able to tease that out. But nonetheless, we think it's really important to look at these associations because we think they can really help us understand the dynamics of that are at play here and to sort of learn more about where we might want to look for causal impacts. Next slide. Great. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit quickly about our methods. I'm sure there's a range of statistical expertise in the crowd. But what we're going to present to you are estimations of the association between milestone completion and outcome, or sort of the connection, right? How much is that outcome connected to this increased likelihood or decreased likelihood of achieving economic stability or family stability? And to do that, we use a regression analysis, and we control for the observable characteristics that we see in the data. So that's things like demographics, childhood experiences, and family background. And this is a pretty rich data set that we're using. And so all of the results that we're going to present for you are regression adjusted averages here. So those are averages after controlling for differences in the two groups that we can see in the data. And once again, all outcomes are estimated between age 33 and 40. And so now I just talk a little bit about the outcomes that we used in the report. So first, to evaluate economic self-sufficiency or economic stability, we have 3 outcomes. First, we looked at non-poverty status, and so that's defined as did the individual household earn at least the poverty line. We also in the report, and I'm not going to present that here, but you're welcome to go look at it, look at middle class status and household income. So middle class status we define as earning 3 times the poverty rate. And the results are really consistent across those three outcomes. And then we went on to family stability. And we defined our family stability outcomes as 1, were there at least 2 adults in a household? 2, the number of residential partner transitions. So for that individual, how often did they switch between the romantic partner that they lived with? So that's going to go up by 1 if someone moves in and up by 1 if someone moves out. And then relationship satisfaction, which is self-reported. And I wanted to just quickly say that the reason that we chose these family stability outcomes as opposed to something that might be a little simpler like divorce is that what we really found was that these were the outcomes that the literature suggested have the strongest impact on child well-being. And so we wanted to focus on the outcomes that were going to be the most important for the children living in the households of these individuals. Next slide. Great. Okay, so let's get into some results. So first we're going to start with that first question of how much do each of these individual milestones, how much are they associated with economic self-sufficiency? And remember that here for these graphs, I'm going to define economic self-sufficiency as earning at least the poverty level. And so what we found is that consistent with prior literature, we found that high school completion, full-time employment, and marriage are all associated with better economic outcomes in young adulthood. So people who graduate high school are about 7 percentage points more likely to earn above the poverty line. People who were employed by age 30 are about 9 percentage points more likely to earn above the poverty line. And then people who got married before age 30 were about 6 percentage points more likely to earn above the poverty line. In contrast, having a child is associated with poor economic outcomes. So people who had a child by age 30 were actually 7 percentage points less likely to earn above the poverty line. And I'm just showing this for poverty line, but these patterns hold across all 3 of our economic stability outcomes. And so like I said, I don't think that any of this was surprising to us. This is really consistent with a very large body of literature on each of these milestones. And I know that I said that we weren't going to talk at all about causality here, but some of these other studies have actually done a really good job trying to break out how much of this is causal and how much of this is just an association. Or for example, might be driven by the fact that someone who is more driven is more likely to complete high school and more likely to have a higher salary down the road. And what we see is that most of them find that some, but not all of this association is likely to be causal. Next slide. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit complicated, so I want you to just bear with me for a minute. So the next thing we wanted to say was, okay, so we see these different pathways in the data, right? We see someone who completed high school, employment, and marriage. And we want to say, well, what would we expect the economic self-sufficiency to look like for someone who completed that combination of milestones? So the first thing that we do here is we say, let's look at the milestones individually. And let's say, okay, we know high school is worth this much, we know employment is worth this much, and we know marriage is worth this much, and we can just stack them up on top of each other. It's a little bit more complicated than that based on the statistical techniques that we use, but intuitively you want to think, okay, I know that someone who completes high school is 7 percentage points more likely to be economically self-sufficient. Someone who completes employment is about 9 percentage points more likely, marriage about 6 percentage points more likely. And so if we just stack those on top of each other, we can sort of get an estimate for the people who complete each combination of milestone. Once again, that's not exactly how it works, but I think you can understand that as a thought exercise. And so that's what this graph shows here, right? And not surprisingly, because of what we saw before, people who complete high school, employment, and marriage are the most likely to be economically self-sufficient. So their rate of economic self-sufficiency based on just these individual milestones alone would be thought to be about 95%. Now, the rate we would think for people who completed all 4 milestones would be a little bit lower because we have to take out that impact of having a child, which is actually negative, like we talked about before. But what we really wanted to say in this second research question is this the right way of looking at it? Is it the right thing to do to look at these milestones each individually? Or do we really want to think about them as a combination? So should we be thinking about the fact that someone who completes high school and employment alone is not just high school plus employment, but that there's something that really defines that pathway for you? Or another way of saying this is the combination really the sum of its parts, or is it something different? Next slide. Okay, and that's what this blue line is. So what we did is we now estimated the associations between each of these combinations of milestones and economic self-sufficiency. And we compared it with what we would have expected based on looking at just the milestones alone. So those striped lines are what you saw in the last slide based on the milestones alone, and the blue lines are what you're going to see if you look at the milestones in combination. And what we find is that they're pretty similar. You know, there are some differences, but for the most part, the sum of the parts, the sum of the impact of each individual milestone goes most of the way to explaining the impact of the combinations. We do see some differences, right? You know, we see that people who complete high school, marriage, and children do a little bit better than we would have expected them to just based on their individual milestones. And similarly, people who just do high school, marriage, and children do a little bit worse than we would have expected them to. But overall, we sort of found that these associations the individual associations did almost all of the heavy lifting here. That did most of the work. And another thing that I wanted to point out from this is that what we see here is that if we're looking at all 4 milestones, we confirm the fact that people who completed all 4 of the success sequence milestones did have a really high chance of at least 90% of earning over that poverty line. But they weren't the only group to have a high chance of earning over that milestone. So for example, people who completed high school, marriage, and children also had a pretty high chance of earning above the milestone, earning above the poverty line, sorry. We also see that people who only complete one or a couple of milestones, particularly one milestone and one of marriage, employment, or high school and children, they tend to have the lowest rates of economic self-sufficiency. We can go to the next slide. So just to summarize that graph a little bit, and I think I spoke to most of this, but what we find is that the associations with individual milestones explain most of the variation in outcomes for the combination of milestones. So what we see is that people who completed high school graduation, employment, and marriage tend to do the best. They're the most likely to earn out of poverty. And that's sort of consistent with what we would have expected by looking at the individual milestones alone. Similarly, we find that young adults who completed all 4 of those milestones are one of several groups who have a really high overall chance of avoiding poverty in adulthood. And that the people that really have a higher chance of being in poverty are people who only completed one milestone or who had children in combination with one of the other milestones. Next slide. Okay, great. So the next question we wanted to ask, this is sort of our third question, was how much does the order that we complete these milestones in matter? So how much does that sequence part of the success sequence matter? And so to answer this question, what we did is we said, let's take individuals who completed at least 2 of the milestones and look at whether people who completed them in order do better than people who completed them in any other order. So when we say in order, we mean that prescribed order of the success sequence, which is high school, employment, marriage, children. And what we find if you look at that yellow line, that's the regression adjusted average likelihood of avoiding poverty for people who completed the milestones in order. And the green line is for people who completed the milestones in any order other than the prescribed order. And what you see, or at least what I see, is that they're really similar. It seems like people who completed the milestones in order are a tiny bit more likely to avoid poverty, but that association is very modest. Next slide. So we also wanted to say, okay, well, that sort of lumps together any type of mismatch or misorder in the sequences, but maybe there are important differences between certain pairs of milestones. So is it important if someone completes marriage before childbearing? Is it important if someone completes employment before marriage or high school before employment? And what we find is that these rates of economic self-sufficiency are really similar for people who do and do not complete these three different pairs in order. We don't find that there's any statistically significant difference in completion in economic self-sufficiency based on the ordering of the milestones. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, there we go. Thanks. Okay, so to summarize the association of the sequence of milestones with economic self-sufficiency, we find that the specific sequence of milestone completion really has a much more modest association with young adults' economic outcomes. So to give you an example, if we look at youth who completed high school graduation, employment, and marriage, those who completed the milestones in order were only about 1 percentage point more likely than those who completed them in a different order to be earning above that poverty line. And that difference is not statistically significant. We did find that the ordering of high school and employment mattered more than any other pair of milestones. You weren't able to see that in the last slide because that doesn't show up as much for the non-poverty measure, but for the measure of joining the middle class, we actually did see a 9 percentage point increase in your likelihood of joining the middle class if you completed high school and employment in the prescribed order. I wouldn't read too much into the causality of that because it seems like there's likely to be a lot of selection going into that. So the type of students who have to get a full-time job before they're able to graduate high school are likely to come from much less strong socioeconomic backgrounds. And so that might be much more of a selection issue than it is any type of causality. So we certainly don't want you to, go back and say, make sure nobody in high school gets a job. That doesn't seem like the interpretation that we should be taking from this. Next slide. Okay, so just to talk quickly about the family stability outcomes. And the reason we're going to talk quickly about this is because there just wasn't that much of an association there. We just didn't see that much of an association between any of the milestones and family stability outcomes. Only being married by age 30 had a consistent association with family stability in young adulthood. The other milestones were all associated with a small difference in the number of partner transitions. Having a child was associated with a small but statistically significant decrease in the likelihood of living in a 2-adult household. And employment was also associated with a small but statistically significant increase in the likelihood of living in a 2-adult household. And remember, this is all measured by age 30. And we did not find any impact looking at the milestones in combination or the order in which the milestones were completed on family stability outcomes. Next slide. Okay, so I know we just threw a ton of information at you at once, so I just wanted to have a slide at the end where we talk a little bit about what we think of as the key takeaways from our research. So first of all, we find that education, employment, marriage, and childbearing are all really strong predictors of economic outcomes in adulthood. And the groups of young adults who have the lowest poverty rates are those who have completed some combination of high school, employment, and marriage by age 30. The groups with the higher poverty rates are those who have only completed maybe a single milestone or a single milestone in combination with having children. But we find mixed evidence on the importance of accounting for the specific sequence or also combination of milestones. So as Hande talked about, we find a huge amount of diversity in the pathways that people take to adulthood. And we think that that's really important for understanding the diversity of experiences. And so we do think that thinking about order really matters for when we think about how we talk about and how we work with people who are taking that transition to adulthood. But we only found a much more modest association of economic outcomes in young adulthood with the order of milestones. So what we really found was that the individual milestones themselves are important and they do most of the work, and which sequence you complete them in matters much, much, much less, if at all. And then we also found no consistent association between family stability outcomes and milestones, with or without accounting for the sequence. Next slide. So that's all we have, and I just wanted to once again thank the Dibble Institute so much for having us here to talk about this research with you. We're really excited to be talking to practitioners and people who have used this, used the success sequence or used other types of research related to the success sequence in their work. And I think we can take some questions.
Thank you, Ariella and Hyundai. I'm going to see if we get some questions in the chat box before I give some of my questions that I've got here. We appreciate you taking the time to explain this update in the research. As we said, we know the importance of this and staying up to date when new information comes out. So thank you for sharing it with us. Okay, well, as we wait for those, I think I heard you say in the beginning that, okay, so I'm going to ask this one, and then we are starting to get some in the chat box, that you excluded GED and the initial, or in these kind of reports here, but that you explored that a little bit. So can you talk at all about the, the findings associated with like a GED in place of a high school diploma?
Yeah, I can take that question. Yeah. So this is something that we debated internally, like how you would, define high school graduation, whether GED also counts as a high school diploma equivalent. And we decided not including GED in our main definition, because usually GED is associated with poorer economic outcomes. When we did include GED in our analysis, our findings held mostly compared to what we found just with the high school definition. So I think it's partly because GED completion is a lot smaller as a percentage in our sample, but our findings did hold for GED as well. But we did not look at the relative impact of or associations of GED with outcomes versus high school completion with our outcomes.
Okay, great, thank you. And then we are starting to get some questions in. So it sounded like you were saying that it's about these milestones more so than like a sequence of these milestones. So we have in the chat box, someone asked, what about this sequence of child before like high school completion? Was that explored at all?
Yeah, and actually, if you can go back, I think it's 2 slides, but it might be 3. Oh, sorry. For your, was that, I might have misheard you. Was it child before high school completion?
Yes. Yeah.
We didn't look at that pair specifically, and I think we did that because, first of all, that was sort of a weird pairing in our model because it was sort of the last and the first. But that was something that would come into play with if in that overall lack of ordering. So that is an interesting pairing that we actually haven't looked at directly, but if there was a major impact of that mismatched pairing, we would see it in the overall impact.
Okay. And then we have another question. This person said, I'm a relationship coach and find that people are waiting longer to get married. Did you also talk to or examine cohabiting couples?
Again, this is something internally we debated a lot. Relationships are changing and people are getting married later and later. We did not look at cohabitation in the study. We really tried to kind of test or examine success sequence in its most common way that it was defined in the literature. We did not. A more recent theories of success sequence or work on success sequence does incorporate cohabitation, but I just want to kind of like use this opportunity to flag a follow-up study that we're conducting, again, funded by OPRE, by the Administration of Children and Families. Currently, we're conducting some qualitative interviews with over 200 young adults, just to see all the pathways and all of the factors that affected the pathways that they took. And cohabitation is definitely one of the things that we're seeing as a more common way of forming a serious partnership. So I'm curious how that will play out with the qualitative data. And yes, it is definitely accurate. It's becoming a more common way of establishing a stable relationship. But in this analysis, we only looked at legal marriages.
So it sounds like we'll be getting a follow-up webinar once that's all done. Okay, let's see. Sorry, the next one's a little bit longer, so I'm just gonna try and do this. Okay, so another person said, I'm curious about 2 data points. Why was biological chosen child, and was the presence of 2 adults married couples or any combo?
I can answer that. So the reason that we went with biological child was actually somewhat of a data availability issue. It was a lot harder to identify when so if somebody adopted a child at a different age than 0, right? It was a little bit hard to identify exactly when they were adopted and think about how to sequence that. And it was pretty rare in our data. We find that not a lot of people are adopting children before age 30, which is when we were looking at childbearing. So that was really a convenience factor, to be honest, that we felt like it was a lot cleaner and more rigorous for us to focus on biological children. And then the second part, sorry, can you remind me of the second part of their question?
Yes. And was the presence of 2 adults married couples or any combination, which is, I think, Hande, you may have started to answer that a little bit.
Yes, and that's actually sort of really does speak to the cohabitation question. We focused on any 2 adults. So not only did it not have to be a married couple, it didn't have to be 2 parents, right? It could be a parent and a grandparent, or a parent and a step parent. And we did that because that seemed to be the most consistent thing in the literature that led to the stability of children. And we kind of got at those transitions by looking at that number of partner transitions, if that makes sense.
Great. Sorry, I'm just answering some of these and making sure that I can ask some of the questions. So just for confirmation and clarification that these research findings are they saying that if an individual has a child prior to graduating from high school, employment, and marriage, that their outcomes are similar to others who complete milestones by 30, or you just do, I guess there were, like you said, a lot of different pathways and a lot of great findings in there. I guess if you had maybe a 2-sentence summative or takeaway, what would that be to explain that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I don't want to sort of overstep by giving you an answer that we haven't directly looked at, but we did directly look at, do people who complete the success sequence in that order differ from people who complete the success sequence in any other order, right? Who complete all 4 milestones, but in a different order. And we find that the economic self-sufficiency rates are really very similar. And we did at certain points look at timing of childbearing. And I do remember that there was sort of, that our results were consistent with that, right? That what really mattered was which milestones you completed, and much less about the order that they were completed in.
Thank you. And the data that you all used in this study, it's a different data set than previous research on the success sequence. Is that correct?
Partially. So there were only, I think, 2 papers that use one of the the data sets that we use, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, we used another national representative data set to leverage different age span that the other data set used. But what we did was, I think we leveraged the longitudinal aspect of the same data set that was used in the previous literature, like more thoroughly. Like we really looked at the entire sequencing of milestones.
Thank you.
Yeah. That we did use that NLSY data that Wing and Wilcox used. But yeah, just like Hande was saying, we sort of leveraged the fact that it looked over time as opposed to just looking at a snapshot in time.
Great. Thank you. And then trying to look at time. I could definitely got some time for a little more questions. So we did have someone who said very informative, so thank you for that. And let's see. So to be clear, when it comes to family stability as measured by relationship instability, marriage before childbearing was associated with more stability. So that's what someone is asking. So you had 3 measures, right, of family stability. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how it relates to marriage before childbearing?
Yeah, so we didn't see a huge impact of marriage before childbearing on family stability outcomes. We have that graph in our report, and you can look at it. You can look at it. We didn't include it here, but in general, none of these sequencing mattered very much for the family stability outcomes. So there was some impact of these, or some association with these individual outcomes, but with these individual milestones. But then once we actually got into the ordering themselves, there really wasn't much. And I'm just, looking at these graphs now so I can answer your question directly. We saw that there was a small increase in the likelihood of having two adults in the household of marriage before childhood, and definitely there was an impact of marriage before childbearing on the number of partner transitions. And there was just about no impact association between marriage before childbearing and being in a happy relationship. And if you do have the report in front of you and want to look at this, it is page B31.
Great, thank you. Very quick to be able to find the exact page and the graph and everything. So I'm impressed when you have that many pages to look through that you were able to pull that off. Let me see. So we did have another person say, great presentation, and we're interested in when the next step of research may be completed so that we can learn even more.
Yeah, so we're in the process of data collection. So we have a while to get something out, but be in the lookouts like early next year, for some findings.
Great. I know it is a lengthy process, that is for sure. So let's see. I guess this will probably be our last question, just looking at time. In previous research, there was kind of like a percentage that was given if you follow the sequence, like these are your odds for, like we said, achieving that economic stability or self-sufficiency. Is there a certain number that we can give youth now with this new research of these milestones, maybe, so that they have that kind of point to lean to? If you do these things, you're this % more likely.
So I'm interested in Hande's perspective on this too, but I'll try to answer that, which is, I think that what we realized in looking at this is that's a really complicated question, right? So I think the first question I would ask you in saying if you do these things, you're this percentage more likely, is this percentage more likely than what? Than if you did only 3 of them, or than if you did 2 of them, or if you did 1 of them? And I think so, and if so, which ones, right? And so we can sort of, for each of these combinations of milestones, we can give you a number that we find in our paper of sort of relative to these 2 combinations, which one, what's the difference in likelihood of economic self-sufficiency? And then you can sort of tack on that ordering if you want to. But I think that sort of what we found is that it's not really success sequence or not success sequence, right? It's what do you do instead of the success sequence that matters, and that matters for that comparison. Hyundai, I don't know if you had sort of another way of thinking about it than that.
Exactly. Yeah, my answer would be the same. Yeah, it really depends on, like, if not success sequence, then what? Like, what are you really comparing to give that percentage?
Well, thank you both so much. We are at time. For anyone, just so you know, if we weren't able to get to your question in this live session, we will make sure that we follow up with you, whether that's Hyundai and Ariella writing a comment and getting in touch with you, or sharing us their responses, and we give you that follow-up information. So thank you again so much for taking your time to share this new and exciting research. For more information, you can contact any of these wonderful individuals that are on this slide. Again, the webinar will be has been recorded and will be posted along with the PowerPoints in just a couple of days, so you can go back to reference that slide for their contact information. Again, 3 days. If you've got questions for the Dibble Institute, you can reach us at relationshipskills@dibbleinstitute.org, and we would be happy to answer any questions you may have. And if you can take just a minute to fill out the survey at the end of this webinar, we would really appreciate it. And along with that, we want to let you know what's coming up. We do have another webinar. It will be July 13th, and we will have our author, Carolyn Curtis, talking about Mind Matters, theories and practices that work. So we hope to see you all July 13th at 4 p.m. Eastern. And thank you for being here today, and thank you